Mm. Yeah, and in the meantime, I'll go ahead and share a little bit of background about myself. I am from Chicago and have been here for many, many decades. But part of my background is actually working primarily with foundations, both public foundations and a private foundation, most recently a women's foundation here in Chicago. And by virtue of working with really a um, wide array of organizations. I got involved in areas such as the arts, the environment, all sorts of different types of policy advocacy fields, even architecture and gender-based violence. And one thing that I've really appreciated being part of working in philanthropy and getting to know a lot of nonprofits is just really seeing and observing how things are quite interconnected, and that one thing is really rooted in all the things that are happening in other parts of the system. So I take that to heart as part of how I think about organization and organizational change. Um, Currently, I have my own consulting practice and working quite heavily with, again, nonprofits and foundations as they think about navigating change within their own organizations, and really with some focus on tending to the relationship or the social fabric as a way to open up um, how do we navigate change, and exploring the assets that we already have, kind of broadening the aperture, if you will, of possibilities versus looking at it only through the narrow lens of deficiencies. So that's a bit about myself. Um, if you can go ahead and fast forward to the next slide, and the actually slide number for with the images of the animals. Speaking of animals, I love animals too. But here, this is just kind of another bit of an icebreaker. It's just really this question: when you think about organizational change, which sheep resonates with you in this moment? And feel free to add the number in the chat that represents that picture, and maybe just like a quick phrase as to why you chose that particular image. And we'll give it maybe 1 or 2 minutes for folks to like type in their responses in the chat. Can everybody see the imagery okay? Mike said number 8 feels like community building. Thank you. Number 6. Feel free to say more about number 6. And I started off looking for images of sheep. I understand that some, maybe not all of them, are quite sheep, but I think that's part of the fun of like picking the image that resonates with you. Number 6, daring changes head on. Number 2, learning curve. Yes, hiring and closing out most active time of the year. All positive, but it might be a little muddy. Yeah, change can be very murky and messy at the same time. It's like you can't comb your hair enough. Listening and getting ready to our next transition. Thank you. Thank you for sharing the sheep that you feel in this moment in our time together. I think one of the reasons why I love using imagery is because sometimes having an image gives us a prompt to express what we're trying to say that sometimes can't be readily said in words alone. And would change, sometimes you feel it, but you can't explain it. So images kind of helps bring about what feels right, to express your own feelings. If you could go ahead to the next slide. Um, Speaking of imagery, here's another imagery that I often use to kind of just put some some context to when we think about change, what's really happening. Often we think of how to navigate change as going from A to B, but the outside world is really very nonlinear. Um, and we are actually living in a very VUCA world. I don't know if that acronym, you've come across that acronym before, but in change management or in systems change, this acronym comes about um, quite a bit, and it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. When you think that you can plan from A to B, the world actually doesn't function that way because the root causes are so intertwined, it's actually harder to kind of make sense of where things started. Um, so this is just kind of like a quick graphic that says, the messiness of the world is quite evident in the world. So, and sometimes in 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 a world where we're trying to think of outcomes that are predictable, we find that there's other things that really come in the process that makes it really hard to predict and also very hard to be certain about certain things because change is going to be inevitable. And uncertainty refers to really any situation where we lack or have incomplete information. There's just not enough information for us to predict the future outcomes with certainty. And certainly a world with change that's constantly changing is a world with uncertainty. Um, so if you can,
Hey,
okay, wonderful. Oh, yeah, please feel free to, if there's any questions in the midst of this, I welcome the questions as well. If you can go ahead to the next slide. And I'm going to take a little bit of an unconventional approach in talking about change. And it's really in sharing certain frameworks or certain ways to actually help us make sense of it that versus kind of looking at it to navigate change as if it's from A to B, but more around sharing some frameworks that can give you a perspective of what situation you're in. So Cynefin framework, again, I'm not sure if anybody's come across it, but in organizational change management, Cynefin, made popular by a guy by the name of David Snowden. And Cynefin is a Welsh word, actually, that means habitat. And simply the significance of Cynefin is that there's multiple intertwined factors in our environment and our experience that experience how we think and how we even interpret the things around us. So he uses this Cynefin framework where he talks about kind of defining the domain that you're in. Sometimes, like I said, like in the previous picture, things feels like we can go from A to B, where there's order. So in this imagery, there's order when things are obvious. So when you're baking a cake, there's a recipe for it. You can alter it a little bit, make it from chocolate to vanilla or raspberry or whatnot. But by and large, you have this recipe you can follow. And time and again, if you do it and you follow it, you'll get the same results. So there's best practices around it. And when you navigate those change, there is some higher likelihood that you'll get the same results. Um, the the quadrant above it says complicated. So here you also know quite a bit already of what's going on. You have knowledge. Maybe you're just building a faster plane or a more integrated database, if you will. By and large, you know what goes in it. You might need to bring an expert to kind of tinker with it a little bit, but you know some of the mechanics already of what goes into things that are in a complicated domain. Again, building a faster jet engine, building that faster database, expertise becomes a key ingredient that you can bring in. On the left side is what David refers to as some things that are disordered. Right? A lot of the issues that we as nonprofits work with are actually sitting in this domain called complex. And in complex, there's a lot of unknowns. And the practices are still not known. So best practices are actually not going to serve you well because you don't know how the interactions among people, among groups, among systems are going to happen and until it actually happens. So in this domain where things are highly complex, but yet very interrelated, he suggests that the more important thing is actually to build the capacity and learn to observe and probe. Probe is really a way to bring people together and have them and have groups kind of reveal certain things that they believe in, certain things that's really driving their own habits. Um, and sometimes those are quite invisible. And part of the challenges is actually making the invisible visible when things are in this complex world. And those complex situations have their own
A
timetable.
bunch of hooey.
Think of a forest. You
Hmm.
can't tell a tree you have to grow several inches by X date. What you can do is kind of fertilize the soil and give it enough nutrients and cultivate it so that it has a higher likelihood of growing. But you can't necessarily define the outcome of how many inches it would grow. And then there's the domain of chaos where things are just chaotic. The fires in California, you just have to act and then take the moment to reflect back to see see what the fuller landscape is yielding for you. But the important point actually, and there's this middle maroon space, is actually knowing what domain you're in, because knowing the domain that you're in means you're able to navigate the change that's happening in those particular situations. So I've used this quite a bit when I talk about decision making and talk about just really sense making of what's happening around our organization, within and externally in the field that we are all working in. Um, if you could go on to the next slide, please. And here's another imagery that also I often use when we talk about change. A lot of change sometimes happens, and we only see the events that happen. So the iceberg is a quite eloquent metaphor, if you will, because a lot of things that we see are above the iceberg, but a lot of the things that drive those changes is actually in the murky waters underneath the iceberg. Sometimes you can't even see it and make sense of it. But the mental models are kind of in the depths. Those are the beliefs that we have, some practices, some habits, norms, and then there's structures and patterns. And in order to really understand the type of change that we're trying to navigate, making some of these things visible, holding space to kind of understand where people are coming from becomes an essential component. and convening people becomes the essential component as well. Um, and then in this final slide, um, I just wanted to kind of elevate and highlight, at least in my observations. If you can move to the next slide, please. Just key elements of things that is important to develop or cultivate in terms of our own inner self and the organizations that you lead, of how to navigate this VUCA world. Adaptability is actually has a lot to do with learning. The process of being adaptable to changing circumstances has a lot also to and it's quite connected to people's learning culture and organizations' learning culture. Um, the process of reflection, often when things go so fast and things change so rapidly, it's kind of hard to pause and reflect on what's going on. But that is also a key element to just kind of make sense. It's almost, how do you see the forest for the trees, literally and figuratively, and slowing down is a big part of that. So saving time for reflection is actually quite important. Um, Shared direction of travel. I alluded to kind of knowing the situation that you're in. That's one level of it. But sometimes when you look outside the door and there's all these different curves and knots outside, by having this understanding within a group of people as to really where you're traveling towards, you might not quite know the road itself, but at least you know you're going north versus east or west is important to have conversations around. And change actually happens at the level of trust and the quality of the relationship. It's the change in interactions that we have with one another that can actually also support the change that we seek. So there's something to be said about also paying attention to the quality of relationships that groups of people have with one another. And the last 2 points refers to the two imagery that I shared, the Cynefin model, and it's really just discerning, understanding like what situation are we in, and give that some time to kind of show itself. And then also the iceberg model of paying attention to what might be lying underneath, that's not readily seen unless you kind of take the time to, in your day-to-day, to make the invisible visible. I think I only have about 10 minutes. So I think I might have used up all my time in sharing these slides with you. So I just wanted to pause a little bit before we dive into the breakout room prompts. If anybody has a question, I know I went through that really quickly, but if anybody has any questions with what I've shared so far. Just curious if any of these frameworks, or even the acronym VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, have you come across that before? Or is that something that it was known to you before? Thank you, John. Yeah, VUCA also very much applies to nonprofits, because our our organizations are also very much interconnected to to other fields and other parts of society and the ecosystem. Or any other just quick thoughts, quick wonders that people might be willing to share or even type in the chat. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think Caitlin let me know if it's okay to maybe. Okay, thank you. Um, Maybe we can actually pose the small group questions
Okay.
and maybe give people time in breakout to just kind of